Thanks, Ole. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that warm introduction, Ole, as well. So, as Ole said, I am a Frontline Fellow, so part of the guinea pig year back in 2014, which feels like a long, long time ago now. But yeah, I've been really lucky to have been working on Crescendo for the last year and a half. I'm going to tell you all about that today. So, let me get started because I don't need to tell you a bit of a spiel about me again because Ole did a great job. But as you can see on the screen, Crescendo is a social worker-led team that believes the current children's social care system needs to be reimagined. So there is me and two others, Michaela and Katie, who sadly can't be here today. And the three of us have been working on this project for a good few years. So let's get into it. So let's talk a bit about the context to why we exist. So the stats and figures on the screen give you a bit of a flavour of kind of what sparked the start of Crescendo. And I'm sure some of these will not be a surprise to you, but let's just go over them quickly for context. So a lot of you will be familiar with the BASWA 80-20 campaign. So BASWA found in 2020 that on average, social workers are spending 20% of their time in direct practice and a massive 80% spent on paperwork and navigating bureaucracy. And at a similar time, Social Work England found around 3/4 of practitioners are saying that they can't help people as much as they want to. And a big proportion of them saying that focus on targets rather than resolving issues for people was a cause of job-related stress. So if we think about the flip side of that, if we actually have more time and we are kind of spending more time in direct practice, the research does say that the relationship between skills and outcomes is stronger. So with the quote at the bottom, if we're able to spend more time with each family, that is an enabler of good practice and outcomes. So not probably too new in terms of what your awareness is of, but that is the kind of context that we came to be in. So we were really interested, like BASWA, in readdressing that balance. So why is it that we're spending 80% of our time on paperwork and navigating bureaucracy and actually practitioners aren't enjoying their work? So we wanted to do something about that. And our whole idea was to kind of think about how can we remove the barriers that prevent practitioners from spending time with families. But we weren't arrogant to think this can be solved overnight. It's a massive problem, right? And we know as social workers that it's complex, but we felt that something could be done. And what we knew is when we think about changing the way we work, we often in social work have a bad experience of it. What we found from personal experience in talking to social workers is it's top down, change is slow, it's overwhelming, and importantly, sometimes it doesn't really amount to much. So we wanted to reframe how we do change, how we start readdressing this balance of where we spend our time. And we've designed a small changes approach, which puts practitioners at the heart of the change. I'm going to tell you about that approach today and hopefully give you some tips about what you can take away to your own local authority context. So what do we do? So we take a 5-step approach to our work with partners, and we've been really lucky across 2022 to work with 3 local authorities in what we've called our pilot year. And we've been really lucky as well. The Frontline Innovation Fund has funded our pilot year working with these 3 local authorities. And what we do is on the screen. So firstly, we set the ambition to our work with our partners before going into this making small changes phase, which I'll hopefully bring alive to you in this session. Once we've made these small changes, we co-develop what we call the local blueprint, and that brings together all of our ideas and all of our work to think about what is further needed to address these barriers that prevent practitioners from doing what they want to do, i.e. spending more time with families. And then we implement, test and embed this blueprint. But as I've said, making small changes is that specific method or what sets us apart. So let me tell you a bit about that. So small changes sits in the space between doing nothing and full system change. So it's about making change manageable and breaking down barriers into smaller steps, which are importantly led by practitioners. So they focus on the barriers that create that stress, frustration, and time away from families for practitioners. So to make this come alive, so it's less abstract, in one local authority we work with, to get a taxi for transport for a looked after child, you had to complete 3 forms to get a taxi. And no one knew why this was the case. Okay. So one of those examples where we're doing something and we're not too sure why we're doing it, but it takes us a lot of time and it creates a lot of stress. So the small change was simple. Change the process, make it 1 form. Another example was we work with one local authority, and when it comes to child looked after reviews, some of you might be aware of this, often the contact details are needed for who's invited. But with this local authority, they would constantly use a new form every time for the contact details. And the social workers, understandably, in my opinion, didn't have time to always do this. So that would stress out business support. It would then involve the IROs as well. And the process became really cumbersome, frustrating for everyone, and actually meant a lot of time was spent needlessly on admin and stress. So the small change here was to bring these kind of stakeholders together, discuss the problem, hour-long meetings, so nothing kind of too extensive. And they created a live doc, which was actually a really simple solution, but kind of tackled these big issues of stress, pressure, and time on admin. So hopefully you can see that when we're talking about small changes, it's not these big things that require legislation or policy to make a difference, but it's those things day in, day out that don't make much sense, but actually cause a lot of disruption and ultimately time away from families. So how do we get to this point in terms of when we can start making small changes? Well, in our first phase of our work, we set the ambition. In other words, we think about where do we want to be and what gets in the way of this. So identifying the barriers provides the structures then making small changes. So what we do is, you can see on the left here, we start with a very simple question and we ask social workers what are the values and principles that they need to be at the heart of their work. And you can see some examples on the left. We then think about what are the barriers to achieving this vision. So in doing this, we have a shared understanding from the very start in terms of the values we all want to commonly live. And you can see some examples from our work on the left. And on the right-hand side, we can see the barriers that stop this from being a reality. Thirdly, we then have a conversation about how big is the gap? How big is the gap from where we want to be, our vision, and the reality that we find in practice? So to provide you some takeaways for today, so it's not just me talking at you, what you could do is if you have management responsibilities or if you identify as a leader, you could bring your teams together and use these questions as a prompt. How do we want to practice? And is this actually a lived experience that we have on the ground? And what are the barriers that get in the way? And as a practitioner, maybe you can raise these questions in supervision with peers or in team meetings. And of course, structural issues will come up, like funding, case management systems. We know that there are these big issues, so we're not trying to kind of negate that or forget that, but our approach is about identifying those barriers and thinking, is there something small we can do to start getting some momentum? So when we have a good understanding of those big barriers or those thorny barriers that stop our vision from being a reality, that stop us from spending more time in practice, that make us feel a bit disheartened in terms of why we came into the role, we can then think about small changes. So we think about how we can chip away at these bigger barriers. So what might be the 10% solution rather than the feeling overwhelmed by the enormity of the barrier? So for example, in a lot of our work, and this won't be probably new to you, a lot of forms and processes, and this multitude of forms and processes is just bizarre and creates a lot of stress and time away from families. But rather than that, feel overwhelmed by that, a small change mindset thinks, well, which one should we change first? And it's led by practitioners. That's the ultimate, like the important thing. And what we're trying to do is create more time for direct practice and listen to practitioners to reduce the stress and pressure of what they're feeling day to day. So we follow a very simple 4-step model. So first, we set the mission. So what is the small change seeking to address? 2, how might we develop it? Thirdly, who do we need on board? Who do we need to influence? What kind of decision makers do we need to go to, perhaps? Or can we do this ourselves? And 4, grow. What is the learning from making this small change? And what can we do going forward? Hence the cyclical process. So if you're interested in creating change in your local authority, perhaps taking a small changes lens can make it feel more manageable. And once you've identified the barriers and some small changes ideas, so some more manageable things that chip away at those barriers, perhaps using these questions can help guide you in that process. Okay. Sorry, my slides went a bit array there. So let me share with you some more examples to help contextualize and hopefully spark some ideas for you as well. So you'll see on the screen here, and I've previously mentioned it, the barrier that came up a lot was the duplication of forms and processes. So what might it look like if we took a small changes approach and started breaking this down? Well, in 2 different local authorities, there's 2 examples of this to again help your understanding. So one with the food vouchers. So in Warrington, what we found was social workers had to go through multiple processes to access food vouchers for families. So I think there was like 3 levels of authorization to get a food voucher. It created stress, it created time, waiting for 3 hours by your emails for that authorization for something so simple. So the head of service heard this and changed it straight away. And the power was given back to the social workers, again having a good impact on morale, but again saving that time that was dedicated to admin on a relatively simple task. Another example in Tower Hamlets, and this will be, I'm sure, familiar to a lot of you, in terms of SIN meetings or core groups or whatever it might be, the responsibility of chairing the meeting, but also taking the notes, can obviously be difficult. And it actually meant that to be present in the meeting and lead that effectively, like a lot of the notes were done and the minutes retrospectively or after the meetings. But what we found in Tower Hamlets is that a lot of the DSLs or other professionals were taking their own notes for their own systems. So everyone's taking their own notes, we're then spending time outside of the meeting to make notes. It just didn't make any sense. So to save time, they piloted shared note taking. They came up with a simple template, the social workers did, and they had a rota system. And it saved time. Again, quite simple, and I suppose working more effectively with our multi-agency partners. So when we were kind of sparking this idea of making small changes, we were really focused on creating more time to spend in practice. But what we didn't appreciate enough was actually coming together and having these spaces for social workers actually has a positive impact on morale and feeling valued. And what we found was that even in of itself, talking about small changes had a positive impact on feeling valued and heard. So in terms of a takeaway, I guess what I'd suggest is that a small changes mindset can sometimes be refreshing. So asking questions and offering ideas for change through a small changes lens can be helpful, because as we all know, barriers to how we want to practice can often seem quite overwhelming and create feelings of pessimism. And as I said before, small changes is not about sugarcoating the problems, but rather than being passive and wait for bigger change, what can we do in the meantime? What's in our sphere of influence? And as social workers, we're busy, right? And with this, it's important to say there's no pressure on achieving something. There's no KPIs or lists going out. It's at the pace of practitioners, but it keeps change on the agenda in a way which isn't tiring. So I've just got a few more slides and I'll open it up for questions. But just quickly, I just wanted to let you know that once the blueprint phase, so once we've made small changes with local authorities, we bring that all together into a blueprint to think about what have we learned and what can we do next. And an example for Wandsworth that we worked with, in Wandsworth, they made this really bold small change in Evolve, their missing and exploitation team that we were working with. And they, as a specialist service, worked very closely with adolescents. And they found that a lot of their time was going to unnecessary meetings where actually they weren't needed. So the bold small change they came up with, which I was personally a bit unsure about because I thought it was a bit too bold, but they came up with it. So power to the practitioners. It's what they wanted to do. They said that they were not going to attend meetings in the afternoons and they were going to put on their email signatures not available in the afternoons, as this is my direct work time for adolescents 5 days a week. So they did that. And I was like, bold. But they had the permission to do it. They all did it together, and it worked. It actually worked. They didn't feel they were missing out on key information, and actually they were able to spend more time with young people, sorry. So the blueprint focused on, wait, we've got something here. How can we think about what next? How can we share this learning with other teams in the service and perhaps, start something a bit bigger? So what we found in our first year is on the screen now. So just two insights here that we actually found from doing this work, from thinking about small changes, thinking about where we want to be and what gets in the way. It actually creates feelings of greater connectedness amongst teams and colleagues, bringing people together and thinking about kind of the how of practice has a good impact. And actually, we on the right hand side of the screen here, they actually found avenues where they could affect change. So the data we got back that actually small changes does have a positive impact in terms of how they can affect change. Linked to those two as well, we found that actually hearing and valuing staff and taking it at their pace, not really rocket science, staff feel empowered and motivated and connected with the purpose of their roles. And this is something we're really interested in considering the landscape at the moment, when we do more work this year, because actually are these conversations actually quite helpful for well-being? I suppose that's what we're interested in and we're going to look at next. And then finally, starting small, bringing people together and showing that change can happen can create optimism. We do a difficult job and there are lots of things to be, I suppose, despondent about. But actually, if we start small and come together and foster connection, can that actually create a bit of hope? So our top tips for you would be to 4 key messages. So in terms of what we've learned and perhaps what you can take away to your own context is, firstly, create spaces for connection. Connection is key, and we'd encourage you to come together in smaller and larger groups to reflect, talk, socialize, and think about your practice. Not so much if it becomes overwhelming, but it can actually help reduce stress and create a foundation to start making change just by coming together. Secondly, we've always been upfront that we believe our guiding principle is that the social care system should be reimagined. And we'd encourage you to be bold and recognise the strengths of the system, but also how things should be better. I think practitioners often struggle with change fatigue and the enormity of the barriers. I get that, but actually starting small and having your voice is quite powerful. But in saying that, my third kind of point would be kind to yourselves, right? Like I said, we're busy and change is difficult and takes time, and we're focused on changing our work with families, and we have to be in the headspace to be able to think about system change. And you might not be in that headspace, and that's okay. So do prioritize your well-being. And finally, if you do find times where you're keen to have your voice, do it. Challenge the status quo, back yourselves. And we don't always have to do the things that we've always in the same way we've done them. There are set narratives of the way we do things in social care. And actually practitioners are experts, but practitioners are often disempowered. So let's look for ways for practitioners to have their voice and back themselves. So that's the end. Sorry, it was a bit longer than I thought, but we've still got a good 8 minutes for questions, which hopefully is okay. And I want to leave you with the quote on the screen, which comes from Beth and Alicia in Wandsworth, who we worked with. And hopefully this quote gives you a bit of inspiration that starting small can have a big impact for you and your colleagues. So thank you so much. And I'll pass back over to Ole.
Thank you, Ryan, for that was brilliant and very thought-provoking, I might say. I'm not going to waffle on too long because I've got questions here. So this is a question from somebody called Tony. And the question is, do you think that the government's social care reforms, which propose co-located multi-agency units with a lead practitioner for safeguarding, will support this model?
So it's really interesting, Tony. Thanks for that question. Like, I couldn't obviously tell you everything today, but what sparked some of this work as well is Casey McKay and I were involved in a document called the Blueprint for Children's Social Care, which proposed a model of doing social work. And we we enjoyed that, but what we realized was that you can't lift and shift models, in our opinion, because it often leads to change being done too. And we developed this way of working in terms of, and see it as a methodology. So we're not kind of we think practitioners have had a lot of change done to them in terms of new models. So we're all about kind of method in terms of giving the space to practitioners to voice what they want to change and then using that as a starting point. So I don't think necessarily that means we shouldn't have models come from government or from the top down, but I'm always curious about kind of how are practitioners involved in that? Also, how are children and families involved in that as well? I think it's an interesting idea, but when it comes to reform, I'm always interested in how the reform's done and are we listening to the right people? Bit of a wishy-washy answer there, but that helped you.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant.